The morning the bank came to take her farm, Ruth Ann Calloway put on her good blue dress, brewed a full pot of coffee, and smiled at the men climbing out of their car like she'd been expecting them for breakfast. What none of them knew, not the banker, not the sheriff's deputy standing behind him with his hat in his hands, was that Ruth had spent the last 6 weeks reading every single word of a contract most men in Cedar Hollow. Kansas hadn't bothered to read at all, and that decision was about to cost the bank a great deal more than it ever imagined. Cedar Hollow sat in the flat wheat country of central Kansas, the kind of town where the grain elevator was taller than the church steeple, and everybody knew whose truck was whose by the sound of the engine alone. Ruth had lived there her whole life, 41 years. The last 16 of them on the Calloway place, 3 miles north of town, where she and her husband Walt had raised wheat, a small herd of Hereford cattle, and one son named Danny, who was 14 years old and growing out of his boots every few months. Walt had died 2 winters back, thrown from the tractor when the frozen ground gave way under the wheel on a slope he'd crossed 1,000 times before. Ruth buried him in November, and by February she was back out in the cold doing the chores herself, because that was simply what a person did when the alternative was losing everything Walt had spent his life building. She had promised him, standing over that fresh grave with Danny's small hand in hers, that the farm would still be there when their boy was grown enough to run it himself. It was 1986, and all across Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, farms were falling like dominoes. Wheat prices had cratered 2 years running, land values had dropped by half, and banks that had been eager to lend money in the flush years of the 70s were suddenly desperate to call those loans back in. The evening news showed auctioneers standing on courthouse steps, selling off combines and cattle and homesteads that had been in families for 4 generations. And every week it seemed like another name Ruth, recognized from church or the feed store, showed up in that grim parade. The Hendersons went first, in March, and Ruth still couldn't think about it without her stomach turning. Earl Henderson had farmed the section next to the Calloway place since before Ruth was born, and when the bank posted the auction notice on the courthouse door, half the county showed up not to buy but to stand in silent protest, hats off, saying nothing while Earl's tractor and disc and even his wife Dot's canning jars went for pennies on the dollar to strangers from 3 counties over. Ruth had stood in that crowd with Danny beside her, and she'd watched Earl's face go the color of ash as the gavel came down on the very land his father had broken sod on. That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the water stain on the bedroom ceiling that Walt had always meant to fix. And she thought about the letter that had come from Union County Bank and Trust 3 weeks earlier, the one sitting unopened on the kitchen table, because she already knew, more or less, what it would say. Her own loan payment was 2 months behind. Wheat, that should have brought $4 a bushel, was bringing barely $2.50. And the cattle market wasn't much kinder. She had done the math a dozen times and there was no way around it. Without some kind of miracle, the Calloway place was going to end up looking exactly like the Henderson place had, an auction flyer nailed to a courthouse door. The next morning she finally opened the letter. It was signed by a loan officer named Gordon Pruitt, a man Ruth had known since he was a gangly boy delivering the Cedar Hollow Gazette on a bicycle. And now he sat behind a big oak desk at the bank wearing a tie that probably cost more than Ruth's grocery bill for a month. The letter said the bank was reviewing her account for possible acceleration of the note, meaning they could demand the whole balance paid at once instead of in yearly installments, and that if she didn't bring her payments current within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. Ruth drove into town that same afternoon, left Danny to finish the evening chores, and sat across from Gordon Pruitt in his office with its framed photograph of wheat fields that had clearly never known a bad year. Gordon was polite in the careful way of a man who has practiced being polite to people he is about to hurt. He told her the bank had no choice, that Union County itself was under pressure from its own lenders and examiners, that half the notes on the books were underwater, and something had to give. "Gordon, I have known you since you were 9 years old," Ruth said, keeping her voice level even though her hands were shaking in her lap. Your mother bought eggs from my mother-in-law for 20 years. Surely there's some room here." "Ruth, I wish there was," Gordon said, and to his credit he did look genuinely sorry. "But the examiners come through in the fall, and any note that's more than 90 days delinquent gets flagged. I can maybe buy you a little time, but the writing's on the wall. You saw what happened with Earl." Ruth left that office with her jaw set tight and a folder of loan documents tucked under her arm, documents Gordon had given her almost as an afterthought. The original note and the refinancing agreement she and Walt had signed 4 years earlier, when they'd consolidated their debt to buy a newer combine. She had signed those papers back then in a hurry, at the kitchen table, with Walt beside her and a salesman from the bank waiting to drive the paperwork back to town before closing time. Neither of them had read every page. Nobody did. It was 30-some pages of dense legal language, and the bank's man had simply flipped through and pointed to the lines that needed initials. That night, after Danny was asleep, Ruth sat at the same kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and a legal pad, and she began to read, not skim. Read every clause, every subsection, every footnote in that maddening small print that seemed designed to discourage anyone from actually looking at it. It took her 3 nights just to get through the original note, and by the 4th night her eyes ached and her coffee had gone cold twice over, but something on page 11 of the refinancing agreement made her sit up straight in her chair. There was a clause, buried in a paragraph about interest rate adjustments, that capped how much the bank could raise her variable interest rate in any single year. The note had started at 11%, which had felt brutal enough in 1982, but Ruth's canceled checks and the bank's own annual statements showed her rate had jumped to nearly 15% within 18 months, according to the fine print in front of her. An adjustment of that size, that fast, simply was not allowed under the contract she had signed. The bank had overcharged her interest for going on 3 years. Ruth read the paragraph 4 times to be sure she wasn't imagining it, then got out every bank statement she'd saved since 1982, spread them across the table like a hand of solitaire, and started doing arithmetic by lamplight. By the time the rooster crowed, she had a column of numbers that made her hands tremble for an entirely different reason than fear. If her math was right, and she checked it 3 more times to be certain it was, the bank had collected several $1,000s in interest it had no legal right to charge her. Money that, applied correctly, would have kept her account current rather than delinquent this whole time. She didn't say anything to Gordon Pruitt yet. Instead, she drove to the county seat and spent an afternoon in the small, dusty office of a young lawyer named Sam Whitfield, who had hung out his shingle 2 years earlier and mostly handled wills and the occasional dispute over a fence line. Sam wasn't a banking specialist, but he was smart, and he was hungry for real work. And when Ruth laid out the loan documents and her stack of statements, he went quiet in the way of man who senses something bigger than he expected. "Mrs. Calloway," he said finally, "if these numbers hold up, and if this clause means what I think it means, you don't just have a defense against foreclosure. You may have a case against the bank for breach of contract." Ruth felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in months, but she wasn't foolish enough to think the fight was over. A clause on paper was one thing. Getting a bank to admit it had broken its own contract, in the middle of a farm crisis when every institution in the state was scrambling to protect itself, was going to be another matter entirely. Sam agreed to look deeper into the paperwork and asked her to give him 2 weeks before she said a word to anyone at Union County Bank and Trust. Those 2 weeks were some of the longest of Ruth's life. She kept up the chores, kept Danny fed and in school and pretending everything was fine. And she watched 2 more families in the county lose their land at auction while she waited on a young lawyer to finish reading fine print she'd already half memorized herself. Danny noticed something was wrong, the way 14-year-olds notice things even when adults think they're hiding it well. "Mom, are we going to lose the farm like the Hendersons did?" he asked one evening while they were mending fence along the north pasture, his voice trying so hard to sound casual that it broke Ruth's heart clean in 2. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Ruth told him, and she meant every word, even though at that point she genuinely didn't know if it was true. Sam Whitfield called on a Tuesday and asked Ruth to come into town. He'd found something even bigger than the interest rate violation. Something that made the folder on his desk practically hum with importance, buried deeper in the refinancing agreement, in a section most people's eyes would glaze right over before finishing, was a reference to a Kansas statute requiring lenders to offer farm borrowers the option of state-sponsored mediation before initiating any foreclosure action on agricultural property. The law had been passed just the year before, in the thick of the farm crisis, specifically to slow down the wave of foreclosures sweeping the state, and Union County Bank and Trust's own paperwork acknowledged the requirement in black and white. "The thing is," Sam said, tapping the page, "I've been asking around the courthouse this week. Not one single farmer who's gone through foreclosure in this county in the last year was ever told about this mediation program, not the Hendersons, not the Petries out on Route 9, nobody. The bank is required by law to notify borrowers and offer them a chance to sit down with a neutral mediator before they can even file. If they skip that step with you, and it sounds like they've been skipping it with everyone, that's not just a technicality. That could invalidate every foreclosure this bank has pushed through this year." Ruth sat very still in that little office chair, feeling the shape of something enormous settling over her, something bigger than her own kitchen table and her own 30 acres of wheat stubble. This wasn't only about saving the Callaway place anymore. If Sam was right, this was about the Hendersons too, and the Petries, and God knew how many other families whose names Ruth hadn't even heard yet, families who might already be packing boxes in houses that legally the bank had no right to take from them. "What do we do with this?" Ruth asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "We do it carefully," Sam said. "We don't tip our hand yet. I'm going to write to the bank requesting mediation under the statute, on the record, in writing, so there's a clear paper trail. And I want you to keep gathering every piece of paper you have, every statement, every letter, every canceled check, because if this goes the way I think it might, we're going to need all of it." The bank's response came faster than either of them expected, and it wasn't the response either of them wanted. 10 days after Sam sent his letter requesting mediation, a certified notice arrived at the Callaway farm announcing that Union County Bank and Trust intended to proceed with foreclosure, and that a public auction of the property had been scheduled for the third Saturday in September, less than 6 weeks away. There was no mention of mediation in the notice at all, as though Sam's letter had simply vanished into the bank's filing cabinets. Ruth drove straight to the bank that same afternoon, past the point of being polite. She found Gordon Pruitt in his office and set the auction notice down on his desk hard enough to rattle his coffee cup. "Gordon, my lawyer sent a request for mediation under state law 2 weeks ago," she said. "You're required to offer that before you can foreclose. Why am I holding an auction notice instead?" Gordon's face did something complicated, somewhere between embarrassed and cornered, and he glanced toward a closed door at the end of the hall before he answered, lowering his voice. "Ruth, that decision isn't mine anymore. It's come down from the regional office. Mr. Krantz is handling all the delinquent agricultural accounts personally now. And he's made it clear the bank isn't slowing down for anybody." Sylvester Krantz turned out to be a broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit who had been sent out from the bank's regional headquarters in Wichita, specifically to handle what he called the bank's agricultural exposure, which was a bloodless way of describing the ruin of half the farm families in the county. When Ruth insisted on speaking with him directly, he kept her waiting 45 minutes in a hallway before finally letting her into his borrowed office, and he did not stand up when she entered. "Mrs. Callaway," he said, glancing at a file in front of him without quite looking at her, "I understand your lawyer has raised some questions about procedure. I'll be candid with you. The bank is under significant pressure from our own regulators to clean up these agricultural notes before the fall examination. We simply don't have the luxury of extended mediation processes on every account." "That's not a luxury, Mr. Krantz," Ruth said. That's the law, and I have paperwork showing this bank charged me interest rates that violated the terms of my own note for going on 3 years. I'd like to know how many other families in this county you've done the same thing to." For just a moment, something flickered behind Krantz's eyes, something that told Ruth she'd landed a blow, even if he wasn't about to admit it out loud. He recovered quickly, folding his hands on the desk with the practiced calm of a man used to talking his way out of tight corners. "Mrs. Calloway, I'd encourage you to have your attorney submit any concerns in writing, and we will of course review them," he said, which Ruth understood even then to mean nothing at all. "In the meantime, the auction date stands, September the 20th. Ruth walked out of that bank with her chin high, but the moment she was alone in her truck in the parking lot, she let herself shake for exactly 2 minutes before she started the engine and drove home to tell Sam Whitfield what had happened. Sam listened, jaw tightening with every sentence, and when she finished he said the words that both frightened her and steadied her at the same time. "Then we don't fight this quietly anymore," he said. "If they won't follow the law behind closed doors, we make sure the whole county knows what's happening in the open." Over the next month, Ruth and Sam built their case like a barn raising, one board at a time, calling in neighbors to help. Sam filed a formal complaint with the State Agricultural Mediation Board, citing the bank's failure to notify Ruth of her rights under the statute, and he attached documentation of the interest rate overcharges as evidence the bank's own paperwork had been mishandled or worse. He also started quietly asking around the county, with Ruth's help, whether any other foreclosed families might be willing to have their old loan papers reviewed. It turned out plenty of them were Dot Henderson, whose family had already lost everything, broke down crying at her kitchen table when Ruth came to ask, then dug an old shoebox of bank statements out of a closet and handed the whole thing over without a second thought, saying it wasn't going to bring back their farm, but if it could stop the same thing from happening to somebody else, she wanted to help. The Petrie family, who'd lost their place back in the spring, found similar irregularities once Sam looked closely enough, an interest cap violated here, a mediation notice conspicuously missing there. Word started to travel through Cedar Hollow the way it always did, over coffee at the diner, after church on Sunday, across fence lines during evening chores. People who had quietly accepted their ruin as simply the way things were in hard times began to wonder, for the first time, whether the bank itself had broken the rules in bringing that ruin down on them. Some were angry, some were afraid to make noise against the only bank in town. But a few, like Earl Henderson himself, started showing up at Sam Whitfield's little office, wanting to know if it was too late to do anything about what had already happened to them. Ruth's own auction date crept closer all the while, a black mark on the calendar that seemed to grow larger every time she looked at it. Danny grew quieter as September approached, doing his chores without being asked, watching his mother with the kind of worry no 14-year-old should have to carry. One night, Ruth found him sitting alone in the barn, running his hand along the flank of the old milk cow the way his father used to, and when she asked what was wrong, he didn't answer for a long moment. "If we lose the farm," he finally said, "do we lose Dad too? Like the part of him that's still here?" Ruth had to sit down on a hay bale before she trusted her own voice. "Your father isn't in the dirt or the fences, Danny," she said. "He's in the way you check the water trough without being told. He's in the way you talk soft to a scared animal. Nobody can auction that off. But I promise you, I am not giving up this land without one heck of a fight." 2 weeks before the scheduled auction, Sam Whitfield got a phone call from the State Agricultural Mediation Board that changed the whole shape of the fight. The board had reviewed the complaint, cross-referenced Union County Bank and Trust's foreclosure filings from the past 18 months, and found that in nearly every single case, the bank had failed to provide the legally required mediation notice before proceeding. That wasn't just Ruth's problem or the Hendersons or the Petries. It was systemic, and it meant every one of those foreclosures might be vulnerable to legal challenge, an outcome that could cost Union County Bank and Trust far more in the long run than a few slow-paying farm accounts ever would. The board scheduled an emergency mediation hearing for Ruth's case specifically. since it was the only account not yet foreclosed, treating it as something of a test case for the whole mess. It was set for the Monday before the scheduled auction, at the county courthouse, and Sam told Ruth in no uncertain terms that this hearing was likely to decide not just her own fate, but set the tone for however many other families' cases might follow behind it. The morning of the hearing, Ruth put on the same good blue dress she would later wear the day the bankmen came to her door, because it was the only dress she owned nice enough for a courthouse, and she drove into town with Danny beside her, and Sam Whitfield's old sedan following close behind. The hallway outside the mediation room was more crowded than she expected. Earl and Dot Henderson were there. The Petrys were there. A handful of other farm families Ruth barely knew by name but recognized from church suppers and county fair booths stood along the walls, waiting to see what would happen. Inside, a state-appointed mediator named Louise Bartlett sat at the head of a long table, calm and unhurried in the way of someone who had done this work long enough to have seen every kind of desperate farmer and every kind of cornered banker there was. Sylvester Krantz sat across from Ruth and Sam, flanked by a bank attorney from Wichita in a suit sharper than anything Cedar Hollow had likely ever seen. Gordon Pruitt sat a little apart from them, looking, Ruth thought, like a man who wished very much he was somewhere else. Sam laid out the case methodically, the way Ruth imagined a good carpenter squares up a foundation, one clean fact after another. He presented the original note and the refinancing agreement, walked the room through the interest rate cap clause on page 11, and showed, with Ruth's own carefully organized bank statements, exactly how much the bank had overcharged her across 3 years, a number that by then had grown, with interest on the overcharge itself, to a sum large enough to more than cover her entire delinquency. Then he presented the mediation notice requirement, and the fact that Union County Bank and Trust had never once informed Ruth of her right to it, despite the statute being printed, word for word, in the very refinancing agreement the bank itself had drafted. And then, because Sam Whitfield had never been a man to leave a good argument sitting half-finished, he laid out affidavits from Earl Henderson and the Petrie family, describing the same pattern, the same missing notice, the same silence where the law required disclosure. The bank's attorney tried to argue that the omissions were clerical oversights, understandable given the volume of accounts the bank was managing during an unprecedented agricultural downturn, and that no harm had truly been done since foreclosure was, in his words, an inevitable outcome regardless of mediation. Louise Bartlett looked at him over the top of her reading glasses, with an expression that made even the confident Wichita attorney falter mid-sentence. Inevitable is a strong word for something the law specifically designed a process to prevent, she said. The whole point of mediation is that outcomes are not always inevitable when both sides sit down and actually talk. This bank denied that chance to at least 3 families that we know of, and possibly more, in direct violation of state statute. I'm not interested in whether that was oversight or strategy. I'm interested in what the law requires now. Sylvester Krantz shifted in his chair, and for the first time since Ruth had met him, he looked less like a man delivering bad news from a position of power, and more like a man doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. Louise Bartlett gave both sides 15 minutes to confer privately before she would issue her recommendation, and the moment the room emptied into the hallway, Ruth felt Danny's hand find hers and grip it tight. "You did good in there, Mom," he whispered. And Ruth realized her son had slipped into the hallway to listen at some point without her noticing, and she didn't have it in her to scold him for it. When the room reconvened, Louise Bartlett's recommendation was blunt, and, for the first time in months, entirely in Ruth's favor. She found that Union County Bank and Trust had violated the mandatory mediation statute in Ruth's case, and, based on the affidavits presented, likely in others as well. She recommended that the bank immediately recalculate Ruth's loan balance to correct the improper interest charges, which by the accounting Sam had prepared would bring Ruth's account not only current but slightly ahead. She further recommended that the scheduled auction be canceled outright, and that the bank conduct a full internal review of every agricultural foreclosure completed in the past 18 months to determine which, if any, had similarly skipped the required mediation step. Krantz's attorney tried one last time to argue the recommendation was overreaching, but Louise Bartlett simply reminded him, in the same unhurried voice, that a state mediation board's recommendation carried real legal weight in agricultural foreclosure disputes, and that ignoring it would practically guarantee the bank's actions would be challenged in open court, with every reporter from Wichita to Topeka almost certainly interested in a story about a bank breaking the very state law meant to protect farm families during the worst agricultural crisis in half a century. Gordon Pruitt, sitting quietly through most of the hearing, finally spoke up, and Ruth would remember what he said for the rest of her life. "Mr. Krantz," he said, "with respect, I think we ought to just do the right thing here. I grew up in this county. These are my neighbors. I don't want Union County Bank and Trust to be the reason there's nobody left farming it." Whether it was Gordon's words or the plain arithmetic of a costly court fight or simple exhaustion, Sylvester Krantz agreed to the mediator's recommendation before the hearing closed that afternoon. The auction was canceled. Ruth's loan balance was recalculated on the spot, the improper interest stripped away, leaving her not only free of delinquency but with a small credit toward future payments. And the bank agreed, in writing, to review every foreclosure completed since the mediation statute had taken effect. Word of what happened in that courthouse spread through Cedar Hollow faster than any grain report ever had. Within a month, the bank's internal review turned up mediation violations in 4 other completed foreclosures, including the Hendersons and the Petrys. And while it couldn't undo an auction that had already happened, it forced Union County Bank and Trust into settlements that gave those families something they'd had no hope of before: a fighting chance to buy back a portion of their land, or at minimum a fair settlement to start over somewhere new with dignity instead of empty pockets. Earl Henderson never did get his father's original homestead back. The man who'd bought it at auction wasn't willing to sell, but the settlement money let him and Dot put a down payment on 40 acres 2 counties over, close enough to visit old friends, far enough to start fresh without the ghost of that auction gavel in every field he crossed. He came by the Calloway place the week before he and Dot moved, stood in Ruth's kitchen turning his hat over in his hands the way farmers do when words don't come easy. "I don't rightly know how to thank you," he said. "You didn't have to go looking into any of this on our account." "You'd have done the same for me, Earl," Ruth said, and she believed it, because that was simply how things worked in a county like Cedar Hollow, where a neighbor's ruin was never entirely somebody else's business. By late October, the wheat was in, the first real harvest since Walt's death that had come in without disaster shadowing every step of it, and Ruth stood at the edge of the north field one evening, watching Danny drive the old truck slow along the turn row while she checked the last of the bins for moisture. The sun was going down orange behind the grain elevator in town, and for the first time in almost 2 years, Ruth felt something in her chest that wasn't dread. She thought about that morning back in September, the one that never actually came to pass. The morning the bankmen were supposed to arrive with an auctioneer and a deputy and a stack of paperwork meant to end everything Walt had built. She had pictured it so many times in the weeks leading up to the hearing that she could see it clear as a photograph, herself in that good blue dress, coffee brewed and ready, smiling not because she had given up, but because underneath all that fear she had known. With the same stubborn certainty Walt used to have about weather and soil, that she had found something real in that fine print, something the bank never expected a farmer's widow to bother looking for. That auction day never happened, not for the Calloway place, but months later when a different notice came, a routine visit from a bank examiner double-checking the corrected loan file, Ruth did exactly what she'd imagined. She put on the blue dress, brewed the coffee, and met the men at the door with a smile that unsettled them more than any amount of shouting could have, because they didn't know yet what she had learned the hard way that whole difficult year, that the folks who read every last word of what they signed were the ones nobody could push around so easily. Danny asked her about it that evening, why she'd smiled at bankmen who'd once nearly taken everything from them. Because your father always used to say the fine print is where the truth hides, Ruth told him, standing in the kitchen doorway with the last light of the day falling gold across the wheat stubble outside. Everybody's so scared of a contract they never actually read it close enough to find out it might just be protecting them too. I read every word of ours, Danny, every single one. And that's how we're still standing here. Danny looked out at the fields, at the grain bins catching the last of the sun, at the fence lines his father had built and his mother had mended, and he himself was learning to keep whole. I'm going to read everything too then, he said. Every contract, every paper, all of it. Ruth smiled, the same smile she'd worn for the bankmen, the same smile she would wear for years afterward, whenever somebody in the county found themselves staring down a stack of paperwork too thick and too small print to bother with. That's my boy, she said. That's exactly how your father and I built this whole life, one word at a time, right down to the very last one. And out past the porch, the wheat stubble caught the last of the light, gold and steady, on land that was at last, truly and legally, still theirs.